don't anticipate that we will be able to cover everything in today's session and also next week's session. What I do want to do is to break down the topic into two parts. The first part being about faith and Iman itself, and the second part being about the Muslim community and the challenges and the opportunities for the Muslim community living in the West. Now, as you see in the course title, we have named it both challenges and opportunities. So, living in the West, we will face challenges, and we are facing challenges in developing our faith and in practicing our faith. But at the same time, we have opportunities, and we have to recognize those opportunities on how we can continue to develop our faith and have a deeper understanding of our faith. So, inshallah, we want to look at both sides of living Islam in the West. This week, we're going to focus on faith, the beliefs of our faith, on Iman in particular. Next week, inshallah, we will focus on the Muslim community and the challenges that face the Muslim community living in the West. So we're going to start it with the outline first. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay. Just need the admin to help me for a moment here, just to move us to the next slide. All right, thank you. So here's the outline for today. We'll start with Muslim settlers in the West and looking at the stages of settlement for Muslim communities in the West. Secondly, we'll look at the importance of knowing your society and what does it mean for us to know Western society, because we're not immune from what happens in our society. It very much influences us, it affects us, and it also formulates our identity as well. Thirdly, the stages of Western society, and this is where I want to focus quite a bit of attention: traditional, modern, and postmodern societies. And then I want to look at what are some of the challenges that we face to our Iman, and what are some of the opportunities that we have for developing our ma'rifah of the deen and our understanding of the religion. And then finally, what are some strategies that we can have for developing faith and for nurturing faith as well. Now, a few housekeeping things before we get started. Firstly, at any time during the presentation, if you have a question, you don't have to wait until the end. Just pose your question on the chat, and inshallah, we will try to answer it at that time. I also want to make this a little bit interactive as well, so I might be posing some questions, and I hope that you will engage in the conversation and provide your responses to the conversation. Not necessarily right or wrong answers. Sometimes I just want some feedback from you to help us move along in the conversation. Secondly, I will take a short break in about 20 minutes because it will be time for Maghrib prayer. And I'll take 5 minutes to say my Maghrib prayer, and I'll come back to the session. And I'll leave you with something to think about whilst I am saying my salat. As you know, I'm presenting from Vancouver. So those are some housekeeping things, but just to get us started first, I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the challenges that we face to our living in the West? And what do you think are some of the opportunities? So let's get started with challenges. What are some of the challenges in Islam in the West? Like I say, there doesn't have to be a correct answer. I just want to hear some of your experiences. of learning Islam, living Islam. أحسنتم. It's not knowing how to interact with non-Muslims, definitely a challenge over there. On one hand, we want to maintain our practices of faith. On the other hand, we do not wish to be influenced when it comes to our faith from sources, and also we wish to have a good interaction with them. How to develop children's love for the Husayniyah is definitely a challenge. Getting them to be there, practicing our faith freely. Islamophobia is a growing and a rising phenomenon. Being a minority, definitely you face Islamophobia. Sometimes you face racism as well. And you have to navigate your way. Understanding what a Muslim identity entails in the West is very important. What is a religious identity? What's a nationalistic identity? What's a cultural identity? So very important topic. Society is not structured with Islam in mind, so the practices of the society or the norms are not according to something that will help us grow. Communicating to other people while you avoid, for example, refusing a handshake with the opposite sex and avoiding alcohol, having a cultural clash, paying taxes that contribute to oppression in the world, um, and working in a place where shaking hands with the opposite gender is commonplace. So thank you for raising those points. I think we recognize, number one, there's challenges towards our understanding of our faith and our commitment to our faith. Secondly, there's challenges towards the practice of our faith. Many of you have mentioned things like alcohol, it could be music, could be dancing, could be shaking hands, could be other issues, could be values that we're not comfortable with, but we have to negotiate those values. And then the issue of culture and identity is an issue over here, and even politics becomes an issue over here. Okay, so quite a few things raised over here. We will not be able to cover all of them today, but the idea was never to cover all of them. What I do hope to provide you with is perhaps a deeper understanding of how some of these issues come about to be so that we're better prepared to deal with them. So if the admin can help me and move me to the next slide. Thank you. All right, let's start with the history of Muslims in the West. And of course, the earliest Muslim settlers came sometime in the 17th, 18th century. They were brought from West Africa, and they came as slaves, part of the slaves that were brought from Africa to America to work in the plantations and to work in the farms over there. And the early Muslims, prayed in America. They had Jama'ah, they had Jum'ah, they wrote tafasirs. Amongst them were scholars, but by far and wide, they did not retain their Muslim identities down the generations, and that was lost. But the second, Muslim wave came around the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And I just want us to appreciate that there were stages of our growth and settlement in the West. So when we speak about the West, generally what we mean is Europe, Canada, America, and parts of Australia or areas around Australia. Let me just speak to Canada and America for the moment. You find that there was a stage in our settlement where some of the early settlers who came from the East, they came only as temporary residents over here. They never meant to stay here for a long period of time. They always aspired to go back to their countries, to go back to Iraq or Iran or Lebanon or Pakistan or India or East Africa. And therefore, they never built institutions over here at that time. They didn't build masajid or schools over here at that time. They did not adopt the language of the place because the whole idea was at some point we are going to go back. And during that period of time, there are examples of where Muslim communities did not even identify their masajid as mosques because they didn't want people to know that there is a mosque, for example, over here. Then we came to the second stage of our where we realized that we're going to be permanent residents over here and we're not going back to our lands for those who immigrated to North America, for example, either because we became used to life over here or because we realized that our children are not going to be able to live, say, in East Africa or India, Pakistan, or Iraq, or other parts of the Middle East. And so we decided that we're going to become permanent residents over here. We built institutions, we built masajid, we started building schools. We adopted a little bit of the language over here. Slowly, it became a part of our mosques and also became a part of our lectures as well. And then came the third part of our growth, which we see in the last 2 decades, or a third part of our transition of being in the West, where, okay, not only are we permanent residents over here, but you find that now we don't think of ourselves as, Iraqi Muslims living in Canada, Indian Muslims living in Canada, East African Muslims living in Canada. When you speak to the next generation or those who are growing up over here, you find that more so they think of themselves as Canadian Muslims or American Muslims, or British Muslims, for example. So it's gone from having temporary residence to being permanent residents to now developing and identifying with the people of the land and considering yourself to be a North American or a European. That has generally been, the growth of the Muslim community here. What's important to note over here that in stage 3, Muslims are increasingly influenced then by Western thought and by Western lifestyle. They have increasingly adopted Western. Not to say it cannot be a Canadian Muslim or an American Muslim, but the moment we adopt the culture of the land, we adopt the identity of the land as well, then we also start adopting the thoughts, the approaches, the ideologies, the norms, the beliefs, the culture of these lands as well. Okay, move on to the next slide. We'll ask the admin to help me out with that. Thank you so much. So, that being the case, so it becomes very important for us to know our society and to be aware of our society. We've got many ahadith that talk to us about the importance of acquiring knowledge. And generally, when we read those ahadith, for example, the hadith says, "Talabul ilm faridah ala kulli Muslim." Acquiring knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim. We generally understand that to mean acquiring the faith, acquiring knowledge about the deen. What are my beliefs? And what are my values? And what are my practices? And there is no doubt that we have knowledge about our beliefs, values, practices. What we also find in our corpus of ahadith is that it's equally important for us to acquire knowledge about our societies and the time in which we live and the culture in which we live, because that also affects us and that also influences us as well. So you have this hadith from the sixth Imam, Imam al-Sadiq, alayhi afdalu salati wa salam. He says, "Al-alimu bizamanihi la tahjumu alayhi al-lawabis." A person who is aware of his time, his zaman, era, his society, he will find that la tahjumu alayhi al-lawabis. Lawabis are doubts, spurious doubts, objections about faith. He will not be overcome by those objections. They will not create doubt within him. So the first point that's important for us to recognize over here is that the Muslim community, when it lives in the West, is not immune from the culture of the host society, is not immune from the philosophies of the host society, is not immune from the problems of the host society. Sometimes I find that within the Muslim community, we can be quite naive to think that as long as we are within the four walls of our masjid, that whatever is happening outside society is not going to affect us. It's not going to impact us. And time and again, we see that the problems of our society, the problems of yesterday, become our problems today. And their problems today will become our problems tomorrow. As a community, we're never immune from what's happening in our society. So we need to understand that if we're going to understand what's going to happen in our community and what is happening in our community, it's very important for us to keep in mind living in the West. The second thing I find in the Muslim community is when we try to understand our society, we focus on the behavior in our society. And so what concerns us is the behavior of our society. And what we try to protect ourselves from are some of the negative behaviors of the society in which we live. And I'll give you an example of this. I had a colleague who once suggested that we should have filters on television. So the shows, when they come to our, they should be filtered even before they enter the television. A filter in the sense that if there is any inappropriate language, then it should be filtered. If there are inappropriate scenes, then it should be filtered. So I asked him, well, what are you going to filter over here? And he said, well, I'm going to filter, you know, inappropriate language, inappropriate scenes, violence, you know, music, for example, dancing, wrong gender interaction, things of that nature. You know, I said, okay, fine. Assuming you can, you can filter that. Tell me, are you able to also filter the wrong ideologies that come through the screen, the wrong philosophies that come through the screen, the wrong beliefs that come through the screen? You see, as human beings, we're very much, you know, we see the zahir, we parent, we see what is visible to our eyes. Behavior is something that's visible to our eyes. So when to understand our society, we try to understand the behavior of our society. And what concerns us is the wrong behavior, and what makes us happy is the right behavior. What I'm trying to point out over here is that more than the behavior of a society, we have to look at the underlying philosophies, underlying beliefs, underlying ideas, underlying theories that are running in our societies. I want you to think of an iceberg. Many of you have heard of this iceberg model, that 90% of the iceberg is underneath the water, 10% of it is above the water. What is visible to us is the 10%. What's not visible to us is the 90%. And yet, what is visible to us is actually being propped up, it is being supported to rise by what is hidden from us. We take that iceberg model, we normally use it for a human being, and we say that what you see in a human being is only 10% of him, what you don't see is the other 90%. And what you don't see is what leads to what you see. His character normally leads his behavior. I say you can say the same thing about a society. The things that you see, the words that you hear, the actions that they do, that's just 10% of that society. The philosophies, the ideas, the beliefs, that is 90% of it. And what's more important is that we understand those philosophies and those beliefs. And that will help us understand the behaviors and some of the practices over here. Okay? So when we talk about the importance of knowing your society, I know as a community we like to gravitate onto things which are physical, which are tangible, which are visible. And so we mentioned, for example, uh, alcohol, shaking hands with members of the opposite gender, some of the norms and practices that they have. What I want to do in this course is to say that is there, but have we thought of what leads to it? We may notice, for example, people are moving away from faith. Well, have we looked at what leads to that? We may have noticed, for example, people are becoming more relativistic in their thinking about morality. Question, what is leading towards that? I think understanding that be far more important than just looking at the behavior itself and how do we as a Muslim community respond to that behavior. Okay. So if the admin can help me, let's move on to the next slide. Or actually, let's go back to the previous slide. Thank you. Okay. So here I do want to talk about traditional society and modern societies. Because when we come to the West, we say that we have come to a modern society. And I'd like to understand that a little bit more. So it is Salah time here in Vancouver. So I want to leave you with a question. And I'll take a break for 3 to 4 minutes to say my Maghrib prayer. And I'll be back. But I wish to ask you that what do you think is the difference between a traditional society and a modern society? Okay. When you say that a particular society is a modern society, what are some of its characteristics? Why do you call it a modern society? What does it have to have before you call it a modern society? All right, so I'm gonna type what's the difference between, and I'll just give you some time to think about that. You can share your answers with me, and when I come back, I'll read through them and we'll talk about it a little more, inshallah. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله الله أكبر عجل فرجه وفرجنا به. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for your responses. I'll just read them out. One of the responses says that first world, financially, technologically, traditional society, third world, you know, not financially and technologically advanced. Um, Modern societies start adopting the ways and culture of the West. Modern societies, newer technologies, services are more accessible. Traditional newer technologies and services are not easily accessible or not widespread. Um, Modern societies idealize the notion of future, pride in change and multiplicity, wants progress for progress. Traditional society looks for the past for its ideals, exemplifies history as a tool to learn from, takes pride in consistency. Traditional sciences are known to be backwards and old-minded. Modern ones follow the trend, generally secular and generally traditional, generally theistic. Okay, so those are answers. It's quite common to associate modern where there is freedom, for example. Traditional societies are societies where there isn't a lot of technology. They are stuck in some of their ways. Resources are not that accessible, and so on and so forth. The first thing I want to point out over here is that the difference between traditional and modern society has very little to do with technology and has very little to do with resources. When we talk about traditional society, the question we're asking is, what is the approach of the traditional man? And when we talk about modern societies, the question is, what is the approach of the modern man? As in, how does the traditional man approach the world and understand it? And how does the modern man approach the world and how does he understand it? Okay, do let me know if the sound breaks up and you're not able to hear, and I need to make sure that we're all on the same page. Um, that's a very important distinction for us to understand. I actually think that it no more makes sense for us to talk about the Western world and the Eastern world. I mean, there are places where it makes sense. I think more so now we need to talk about the modern world versus, for example, the traditional world or a traditional lifestyle. You could have a traditional society in the West, and you could have a modern society in the East, because the differences are not geographical, they're not necessarily related to technology, but they're related to our approach. Okay. So I'm going to actually give you concrete examples of the difference. But see, we understand those differences, then we understand some of the changes happening in our society. Then we understand what are the challenges that we are facing from a very philosophical perspective. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So Western society has gone through these stages. We used to be a traditional society, slowly moving towards modern society. So in the West, traditional society existed prior to the 16th century. For example, what is known as the Dark Ages, they would say at that time that Western society at that time was a traditional society. It was a society that was focused on Christian theology, and it was run by Christian theology as well. Primarily, the focus at that time was on God and on serving God, human beings being the creature of God or the representative of God on earth. And the focus was also very much on the church as well. The church wielded a lot of influence and wielded a lot of power in people's lives and in their societies as well. During that period of time, because there was a belief in God, there was a belief in scripture as well, scripture being the guidance from God. In the case of the West, that being the Bible, you found that people back then submitted to the authority of the scripture. Okay, so just stay with me here because these are some very important discussions. You find that in traditional society, people submit to authority. So if an authority tells them this is how it ought to be, they will generally follow it. When we come to modern society, you find that people generally don't submit to authority or not the traditional authorities anywhere, right? Anyways, they have, for example, an approach to intellectualism. So they will say, no, I'm not going to accept what you say just because it comes from scripture or because you are a priest. Um, you need to be able to rationally explain it to me. For example, you'd see it in the Muslim community, a Muslim community which is traditional. As a scholar, I can go in there and say that don't listen to music. Why? Because the sixth Imam says that whoever listens to music, then, for example, this will happen to him. That's more than enough. Wear the hijab. Why? Well, because the hadith says that, I'm wearing of the hijab is wajib, and all I have to do is prove that wearing of the hijab is wajib. The traditional society is submissive to authority. Modern society says no. Um, you need to give me a reason for it. You need to give me a reasoning behind it. And when you give me a reasoning behind it, so why shouldn't I listen to music? Tell me how it is harmful for me, and I won't listen to it. Tell me how it's beneficial to wear the hijab, and I will wear it. See, right now, I'm not saying whether the modern approach is right or the traditional approach is right. I just want us to appreciate the societies in which we live. What are the underlying differences between these societies, and for those who are immigrants, the societies from which we came from? One of the underlying differences is that when we grew up, perhaps we didn't ask why this and why that. But the children growing up over here, when it comes to teaching the religion to them, they are going to ask why this and why that, because that's a feature of the society in which we live. We want to understand. We don't submit to authority, for example. Well, if you don't submit to the authority of the scripture, then you don't even submit to the authority of the priest either, because the priest is the one who explained the scripture. Another important difference between traditional society and modern society is that traditional society was very collectivistic in nature. Um, so people actually served the family. They served the integrity of the family. They served the community. The community was more important. The needs of the whole, the collective, were more important than the needs of the individual. So, for example, in traditional societies, people bore a lot of hardship, worked very, very hard, made a lot of sacrifices on their own behalf, just to maintain the integrity of the family, to maintain the unity of the family, to maintain, for example, the honor of the family. Again, I'm not commenting on whether that is completely right or not right. This is generally found in the approach of the traditional man. Traditional society, that's what it means. For example, a collectivistic society. As opposed to that is the modern society. In the modern society, the human being is not collectivistic, he is increasingly individualistic in his approach. And that's a very important distinction that came about after the 16th or 17th century in Western society. So let me give you an example now. You'll notice, for example, in traditional society, people ask, what's my duty? What's my responsibility? What responsibility do I have to my parents, to my children, to my spouse? For example, a child who was growing up grew up with a sense of duty. I have a duty towards my parents, right? On the other hand, you come to a modern society, it's very, very different. People don't ask what's my duty or my responsibility. The first thing they ask is what is my right? Yes. And how can I safeguard my right? Because that's primary, right? And then duty and responsibility is secondary. You see how the approach in the thinking is very different, right? So that typifies modern society. This typifies traditional society. In Western society, traditionally, the duty was to serve the king or the queen or the empire, because in traditional societies, generally, they didn't have nation states. Nation states started to develop much, much later. So if we then go to the next slide, the admin can help me, and thank you so much. So, Western society after the 16th century goes through a shift, and a gradual and slow shift. The Renaissance comes about, the Age of Enlightenment comes about, industrialization towards the 18th century comes about, the Reformation comes about in the church, the Protestant movement comes in Western society. It is important for us to understand a little bit of that, to understand where Western society is at right now, and what are we grappling with when we live as Muslims, when we practice Islam, living in the West. So after the 16th century, the first you notice is that the church becomes weakened. And the church had, in our opinion, made mistakes in the way it approached things. The church did not believe in the need for rationality. So the church cast out rationality. The church was corrupt, and that's why you had the Protestant movement, or the Catholic Church had become corrupt. So you had the Protestant movement at that time, and the church was extreme in some of its views with respect to human beings and human rights. So you get a reaction to that, and that comes in the 16th, 17th century. It ushers in modernity, and the first thing that it ushers in is rationality. And when rationality comes in Western society, they also do away with revelation or scripture at that time. So I want you to keep these things in mind. And I know we're going through a little bit of theory over here, but do stay with me. So they believe that there's a truth. But how do you achieve the truth? Well, there's two pathways to it. One is to use your reason, and the second is to use revelation, like Quran, like, for example, the Bible. When the modern age comes in, they do away with revelation. We do not need scripture. We do not know about this revealed book or inspired book. We do have reasoning. And reasoning and rationality is going to be the standard for the truth. And we don't know about God and belief in God. We are kind of slowly going to move away from that. And well, it brings about the weakening of the church. And now you see a growth of humanism. So, for those of you who are not aware of these terms, humanism is a philosophy where the focus is on man and the needs of man and how to help man, as opposed to a focus on God. Okay? And also naturalism. So, now beginning to explain the world using nature and natural phenomena, and doing away with the metaphysical world and doing away with the higher world. They submitted to the authority of reason, and they also submitted to empiricism, or the scientific method. And that starts to define the modern world. It's also very individualistic in its approach. People talk about their rights, people talk about their individual needs, and from that you see the growth of liberalism. And finally, in the modern world, you see the growth of nation states and democracy. And the duty of the state is to protect human rights. Okay, so some of the differences between traditional society and modern society. Now, let me ask you a question over here. The societies in which we live, are they more like traditional societies, or are they more like modern societies? Okay. All right. So many of you have said modern societies. Why do you say that? What have you noticed in your society that they're mostly modern with a nostalgia of the traditional society, mix of the two a little bit? Yeah, sometimes you do see collectivistic trends, sometimes individualistic trends. Sometimes we submit to reason and sometimes we submit to tradition. Okay. Okay, individualism, authority of reason, and less authority of God. That's a very interesting comment, Brother Ali Raza. Just as a side there, is reason not a means for knowing what God wants from us, or is revelation the only means of knowing what God wants from us? Because you have contrasted reason, the authority of reason, to the authority of God. But individualism is correct. We see a lot of that in modern society. Let me ask you, what are some things that you see in your community or in your society where you can see that the approach of modern society is affecting our faith and our faith identity? You must observe certain uh, behavior in your community, in your children, in yourself, in your family, in your society, where you can see that the modern approach of rationalism, of humanism, of naturalism, of reasoning, of empiricism, of liberalism, individualism, of materialism, right? Because now in the modern world, you do away with the metaphysical world. Everything is explained by science. Whatever exists is what the eyes can see. Okay, so faith is restricted to the personal realm and not the public realm anymore. Public professions of faith are even seen as ridiculous or exotic quirks. That's true. And the reason for that is that there has been this dichotomy that has been created, that the difference between religion and science is that religion is based in faith and science is based in fact, in reasoning, in intellectualizing things. And therefore, a person who has religion is a person who has faith without reason, who has faith without intellect, who has faith without fact, and therefore must be sort of a quirk or a crazy person, because the only way to understand things is, of course, through empiricism and also through rationalism. Right, we question things that Islamically should require automatic submission. So yes, we do question a lot of our practices of Islam. Why do we do it this way? Why do we do it that way? Why not this way? Why not that way? We don't blindly submit, or we don't submit sometimes, even if there is a clear hadith to that effect. Okay, I mean that's a characteristic of modern society. When something does not make sense to us, we reject it. Yes, because reason is the only standard that modern society accepts. It doesn't accept revelation as a standard for understanding the truth. So if something doesn't make sense to me, I will reject it. Okay. People do not seem to get to know their neighbors as much. Yes, we are a very, very individualistic society. Our neighbors don't mean that much to us. We don't know them. We don't have a meaningful relationship with them. We'll see next week, inshallah, that communities don't exist in modern societies. Youth in the community asking what's wrong with being Muslims while having a friend of the opposite gender, someone who identifies with being lesbian or gay, for example, concept of equity and equality. So one thing I haven't put on the screen over there, but thank you for bringing that up, is that more and more we live in a secular society where the role of government is not to impose a particular value, it's not to impose a particular set of beliefs, but is to let people be free, right? The liberalization, for example. And the role of government is simply to ensure that people's rights are not trampled upon, people's rights are not taken away from them. And that slowly has also then come into our morality and our thought as well. Let that person live the way they want to live. They have the freedom to do whatever they want to do. I have the freedom to do what I want to do. What's wrong with, me, for example, being friends with them, or even, for example, advocating for their rights? Yes. Um, so we might say it does not work for our time. There's an idea that democracy leads society to what's good for the people, right? So, as long as it's a free society, it's a liberal society, you let people have their freedoms, people will naturally tend towards that which is good, and they will naturally tend towards that which is righteous and moral. Okay, some very, very good answers. And what I'm really gathering from the conversations here is that we're beginning to understand the difference between modern society and traditional society. What I want to tell you actually is that we neither live in a traditional society or a modern society. We actually live in what's a post-modern society. So the story goes this way, that as modern society came about and rationality came about, and everything was broken down into the material world, and there was no sense of the spiritual or the metaphysical world, and everything was brought down to a science. We were industrializing, resources were becoming plenty, democracy or so-called human rights was spreading. The assumption was that it would lead to utopia. We have finally come out of the dark ages. We have gone through a period of what is known as enlightenment. And yes, we are now going to have peace on earth, and we're going to have a lot of resources on earth as well. Except when you come to the 20th century, you have the First World War, and you have the Second World War, and you have a lot of pain and suffering in the middle of the 20th century. And it causes a lot of people to revisit modern thought, the thought between the 16th century and the 20th century, and to start questioning some of the premises of modern society, like rationalism, like subjective truth, like authority, even for example, scientific authority, like empiricism, right? A lot of that starts to be questioned. So if we go to the next slide, if the admin can help me with the next slide, thank you so much. So post Second World War, there was a disillusionment with modernity. Modernity was supposed to be the holy grail that brings us Jannah on earth, and it brought about the Second World War. It brought about colonialism as well, and it brought about a lot of other problems. So, in postmodern society, again, we're not talking about what era we live in, we're not talking about what place we live in, we're not talking about the technology that's being used. It's not about social media, it's about the approach. It's so important for us to understand this approach because when you understand this, you'll understand a lot of the thinking in the community. As I said, we are not immune from the thoughts of our society. And it's not something that sometimes we're consciously aware of. Somebody's got to point it out to us and say, look, this is how they think. That thinking is coming into your understanding of faith and it's changing how you understand faith. Well, unless you understand that, you really cannot understand why is our understanding of the faith changing, right? So important to understand that. So come to postmodern society. Premise number one, there is no objective truth. there is no higher truth. Okay? Many of you must have heard by now that they say we live in a post-truth society where truth does not have the value it used to have anymore. Well, you'll say that doesn't affect our faith. Oh, of course it does. Of course it does. Right? So, for example, politicians have realized we lived in a post-truth society. If you follow the news and the media, you'll notice that, the truth is no longer that important. Donald Trump, for example, recognizes that you don't have to speak the truth. People necessarily don't believe that there is something like an objective truth. All you have to do is you have to be able to tap into people's emotions, tap into their feelings, tap into their prejudices. That actually formulates the truth for them. Well, that also happens in our community as well. You will notice that truth no longer has the value it used to have. And I'll give you examples now. For example, today, even if you go and tell a person, Islam is the best religion on earth, Islam is, or Christianity is the best religion on earth because it is the truth. Look, these are our beliefs, and this is why our beliefs are true. They will say, you can tell me all you want about your beliefs. Tell me, what difference is it going to make to my life? Is it going to make my society a better society? Show me the functionality of it. Don't make me claims about what is truth or not. Who knows what is truth or not? I mean, haven't you heard in our own community where sometimes people would say that, we don't know which religion is the true religion. Everybody has their beliefs, and, God will judge, for example, which beliefs are right or wrong. All that matters is that you are a good person, correct? Well, what about the truth? But don't you think that, there is one God and prophets came down and there's a day of judgment and that truth has a value? It's important for us to submit to the truth. Well, we live in a postmodern society. Truth has lost value. There's no objective truth. If there is any truth, it is subjective truth. It is subject to yourself. See, that which seems so academic actually can be viewed and seen in the thoughts of our community, in how we think about our religion. Well, if there is no truth, then not only do we do away with revelation, modern society did away with revelation, postmodern society also does away with reasoning as well, right? And it says that, well, there's no such things like objective reasoning where you can go through a process and you can demonstrate a truth because there is no objective truth. Well, question, if revelation and reasoning are not a standard for the truth, tell us, what is a standard for the truth, right? And they'll say, well, it's your feelings, your emotions, your experiences, your personalities, your conscience, a whole bunch of these things, right? And therefore, you find, for example, one of the most important conversations in modern society is don't allow anybody else to tell you what to do. Haven't you heard that? You should be authentic to yourself. Authentic to yourself, meaning you should come across a reasoning, you should come across a plan of action that is in line with how you feel. So in postmodern societies, feelings and emotions become the standard for the truth and not reason or revelation, right? So today, for example, you ask a person, what is spirituality? Spirituality is what I feel. What about ethics? Well, ethics, when something is correct if I feel this way about it, okay? So it does away with reasoning, does away with revelation. Well, if it's done away with reasoning and revelation, it's also anti-authority as well, right? There is no authority, and therefore the person himself becomes his own authority, okay? Now, you might say this is very theoretical. This doesn't really have any applications in modern society. But think again. For example, one of the growing trends that you might notice in the community is questioning about marja'iyah and questioning about, how can a marja know everything about Islam and how can his interpretation be the correct interpretation? And how can we, for example, follow his interpretation? Why can't we follow our own interpretation? Shouldn't a human being have ownership of what he's going to do? Shouldn't a human being think about what is right and what is wrong? Why would a human being allow somebody else to think for him and say what is right and what is wrong? These are thoughts, but you have to ask yourself. 20 years ago, people didn't ask these questions at the level that they're asking today. So what's changed now from 20 years ago, right? Oh, we live in the West. We live in the West, right? The geography hasn't changed. So what has changed? What has changed is that postmodernist thought has become much more entrenched within our communities. And postmodernist thought is anti-authority. It says that a human being is his own authority. He gets to define. He should be the one who tells himself, right? And then this the statement that comes out, don't let anybody else tell you what to do, right? To some extent, that's correct. Yes, when something is right, don't let somebody else stop you from doing it. But to say completely there is no authority at all, well, that's what's leading to what we're seeing in our community with respect to the authority of the marja'iyah or the authority of the scholars of the religion. And one of the things in postmodern society is no defined purpose to life and leads to the rise of existentialism. I don't want to get too philosophical about that. Um, Thank you, Ali Reza. You're giving us some more examples, being true to yourself, doing whatever feels good, and a person becoming his own authority. Um, these sound like examples of individualism, but maybe I misunderstood. Um, so individualism is where a person associates, yes, of course, importance to themselves, but they associate, for example, more so it has to do with your own rights and what is beneficial for you as opposed to collectivism, right? So in a collectivistic society, you look at what is in the interest of the society and you're willing to sacrifice yourself for the interest of the society. Individualistic society, no, you want to safeguard your own rights, you want to safeguard your own freedoms and liberties, and the collective good sometimes is not that important to your own rights. But when I'm talking about anti-authority, it's now about understanding the truth, right? In modern society, for example, you will notice one thing that 30, 40 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago as well, when people would talk about the Quran, yes, they would come and say, for example, let's talk about the scientific miracles of the Quran, because science, empiricism was very, very important back then. It was still kind of a modern society where science was important. What have the scientists said about the Quran, right? What have these great scientists said about the Quran? Why? Because there was an authority. The authority were people who were thinking rationally, who were fact-based, who were testing their hypothesis. So if a scientist came and said, yes, I've seen scientific miracles in the Quran, that was very, very important to us. So in modern society, they even accepted, even if they were individualistic, but they accepted that there are people who are experts in the truth, correct? Well, when you come to a postmodern society and you do away with reasoning and you say we're a post-truth society where truth doesn't have so much of a value, then we no longer give importance even to scientists or even to philosophers, right? Then the person is his own authority, and a person himself decides what he thinks is right and what he thinks is wrong. So if we understand some of the differences, and I don't expect that we will grasp all of it in the presentation right now, but I just wanted introduce you to this idea that, when we talk about living in the West, yes, we can talk about what is the West. We can talk about popular culture in the West. We can talk about some of the challenges that we face in the West. But let's talk about what are the underlying trends within the West. And in context of what? So, it used to be a traditional society. Then there was a reaction to it and came a modern society. And there was a reaction to that and came a postmodern society. Well, today, for example, when you see pluralism and such a growth in pluralism, right? And you ask yourself, where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from this idea that the truth is relative. And the idea of the truth is relative is also coming from this idea that no, there is no, for example, single reasoning. There's no single rationality. There's no single revelation that can tell you what is the truth. The truth is what seems true to the beholder, right? And therefore, you know what? You could have a very pluralistic outlook of faith. The Christian can be right and the Muslim can be right, and the because what standard is there? There's no reason as a standard. There's no revelation as a standard either, right? So then these trends that we see, being authentic, being pluralistic, for example, right, being anti-authority, well, all of that is actually a function of postmodern society. And the reason that this exists, the underlying assumption to all of this is that there is no objective truth. Okay? But things like that are very, very profound for us to understand as we live in Western society and we grapple about questions of faith. Unless we kind of pick up on these things, it becomes difficult for us to understand, well, where are some of these ideas coming from? I've shared quite a bit up until here. I still have some more things I'd like to speak about. We get into some more practical things now. Before I move on, are there any questions about, traditionalism, modernity, and postmodernity? Okay. A couple of last points. Traditional, modern, and postmodern ideas, yes, they are debated and written about in academic circles and the universities. But it doesn't mean that we're immune from them because they are spread uh, through popular culture and lifestyle. So, for example, one of the things I find that's very interesting to look at are some of the one-liners that come out in today's society. These sound bites that come out, and do pay attention to them because they'll tell you a lot about our societies. For example, sometimes you might hear at a graduation that do whatever makes you happy. That's the last thing I can share with you. What do you mean, do whatever makes you happy? A traditional man would never have thought like that. Even in modern society, you wouldn't have thought like that. But in postmodern society, where feelings and emotions become the standard, yes, that one-liner from a 7-year-old definitely makes sense. Um, that's okay if you have to leave. I understand completely. I think the recording will be put on online, and inshallah, you can follow the recording before the next session. Or dream until your dreams come true, right? Or even, for example, if you listen to some of the children's rhymes and children's songs, postmodernist ideas very much a part of that. I want to be free, for example. I don't want anybody to tell me what to do. Yes, it is spread through popular culture, through books that children read, through TV shows, through movies, and generally through the news and the culture in which we live, number one. And number two is Eastern societies may also have a modern or a postmodern approach, is not limited to Western societies. Okay, so if you can go to the next slide, some of the challenges that we face, challenges and opportunities. So, what are some of the challenges posed by modern and postmodern ideas to faith itself? And what are some of the opportunities within modern and postmodern societies? Okay, let's just look at the first one today. What are some of the challenges posed by modern and postmodern ideas to faith. You have shared some of those challenges. So I'm actually going to go to the slide. If I can ask the admin to take me to the next slide. Thank you. I've listed some of them over here. I'm sure there is a lot more that can be listed over here. So, number one, the need for faith and organized religion is questioned. Previously, you wouldn't ask, why do we need faith? I need to know the truth, I need to know the haqq, and I need to submit to the haqq, and I need to, of course, reject batil. And faith tells me what is haqq, and my religion, tells me what is batil. Well, today it's no longer about that. Well, what function does faith serve in my life, in my community? And why do I need faith? What's the functionality of faith? Okay, that's one question that comes up. Secondly, exclusive claims to the truth are not easily accepted. So this idea that one religion is the true religion and it has the entirety of the truth in it is not generally accepted. I'm not talking about our society. Within our own community, if you hear people talking, they'll say, yeah, we believe in different things, but you know what? Our ethics are the same. It doesn't matter what we believe in. As long as we are good people, then, that's what's more important, for example, right? And so exclusive claims to truth, like saying one religion is the right path, you find in modern or postmodern societies not easily accepted. Three, scientific explanations replace religious explanations, right? And you see that in science. Previously, if you asked who created man or who created the world, people would have said, well, God created it. How do you explain the diversity of life on Earth? Well, God created it to be diverse. But more and more, you find scientific explanations now replace religious explanations. Why do earthquakes happen? Well, because the tectonic plates shift. Why do hurricanes happen? Well, because of this reason, for example. How did, diversity of life come about to be? Well, because of mutation and natural selection. So scientific explanations replace religious explanations. In modern societies, anyways, postmodern societies can be a little bit different, and that only does not only apply to, for example, beliefs. It applies to values as well. When we talk about things like orientation, you find that the view of the psychologist becomes a lot more important than the view of, for example, religion, right? Because scientific explanations more and more now begin to replace or take precedence over religious explanations. Four, scriptural claims and values are critically evaluated. So previously you could say, this is what the Quran says, based on the Quran it is wajib, and therefore, you know what, no questions are asked about that. Now, not anymore. Why is it like that? And one thing I want us to appreciate is that, living in the West, the questions are not only going to be about our belief in God, or belief in prophethood, or belief in the Day of Judgment. More and more the questions are about human rights and human liberties and human freedoms, because we live in a secular society, and when Scripture says that, oh well, for example, there are certain restrictions that we put on human beings. We put restrictions on human societies. People are not free to do these things. Well, why? Why aren't they allowed to do that? Why do you say, for example, an apostate, should deserve this particular punishment? And there's a whole conversation over there, which I don't wish to go into right now. But why? Why do you say that, for example? So scriptural claims and values are critically evaluated, or they're questioned now. Number five, scriptural authorities are replaced by individual authority, right? I don't need a scholar or a marja to tell me what my duty is. I should be able to think about it myself. I should be able to research it myself, and I should have ownership of what I'm going to do. A lot of these trends that are appearing right now, even within the Shia community, if you understand postmodernist thought, you will see exactly the underlying foundation to those trends, right? Number six, growth of increasingly diverse interpretations of faith, because now everybody has their own interpretation of the faith, and many, many more. For example, one other thing I can point out to you is we spoke about identity, right? And what is our identity? And I remember a while back, I was at a particular conversation, and a young man there said that, I think as Muslims, we should think of our Canadian identity as being our primary identity, and then our Islamic identity being our secondary identity. So the nationalistic identity being primary, and the religious identity being secondary. Now, we could, of course, argue that from a faith perspective and say that, well, let's see what the Quran says. The Quran say that our tribal or nationalistic identity should be primary, or does the Quran say that, for example, our faith identity should be primary? And we can come and present the verse of the Quran that says, "خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُم شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ." We made you into tribes and clans, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may know one another. إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. Surely the most pious, or surely the most honorable, sorry, in the eyes of God amongst you is the one who has taqwa, right? So bring a verse of the Quran and explain it. But here's the question that, we ought to think about. And the question is that, well, what has changed in our thinking that we would give precedence to our nationalistic identity over our religious identity, over our spiritual identity? And you have to dig deep in there. When you dig deep, you come to realize that in the past, the akhirah was more important than the dunya, right? The higher world was more important than the lower world. So our identity to the higher world was more important than our identity to the lower world, right? One had to do with the soul, the other has to do with the body, yeah? And the soul was always considered to be more important than the body. But come modern approach, where it's all about empiricism, what you can test, what you can see, right? The dunya becomes more important than the akhirah. The dunya becomes more important than the higher realm, right? I remember one of the, I don't want to take, one of the so-called reformist personalities that, one spoke about, reforming Islam. They say that one of the reforms you have to bring about in Islam is that there's too much focus, or the focus primarily is on the akhirah. We need to make the focus on the dunya and living life in the dunya. When that kind of thinking permeates and becomes part of our society, because we are influenced by the modernist approach or postmodernist approach, then it's natural that we would think that our nationalistic identities should be more important than our spiritual identities, right? So this is where it helps us to understand the differences. Now, if I were to ask you, these are some of the challenges to faith. Can you think of any opportunities for developing faith in the modern or in the postmodern approach? What are some opportunities? Well, I'm sure there are some positives. Um, See if you resist the trend. So it is a test from God. And, it's a test of how strong our faith is. And if, we are able to resist the trend, then we will have a higher level in Jannah. That's entirely possible as well. Yes, you're right about resisting the trend, but when you have to resist the trend, what does it force you to do about your own faith? What does it force you to do about your own understanding of the faith? Okay, a stronger conviction to faith. Yes, in the end of the day, if you're able to overcome some of these thought patterns, some of these ideologies, you definitely have a stronger conviction in your faith. How does that stronger conviction come about? Okay, so I'll ask the admin to take us to the next slide. Um, so opportunities for faith, I've just listed some of them over here. It's not an exhaustive list. People are so delusional that faith can give them purpose to life. Yeah, that's right. In today's day, people have lost a sense of purpose in life. They have tried to find it in entertainment. They've tried to find it in careers. They've tried to find it in procuring goods and services. And as the sixth Imam says, the dunya is like drinking salt or seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. So there's an opportunity where faith comes and gives a sense of purpose to their lives. Develop a nuanced and intellectually grounded framework for understanding in Islam that addresses and anticipates contemporary concerns. Very good. Develop a deeper understanding of our faith if we are going to be able to overcome some of the challenges that we face to our faith. Now, being a cultural Muslim is not going to be sufficient. If you're a cultural Muslim, you follow the trend in your society. Well, you live in a society that's not an Islamic society. So if you want to buck the trend, then you have to become a rational, intellectual Muslim. Very good. Because of relativity, there's space for us to build arguments for a truth which can be religious. Um, so let's put it this way, that people are perhaps willing to listen and to give you that space to develop an argument for the truth. And they may be even willing to listen to your argument for the truth, and that gives you the space to convey it to them. So, number one, it forces us to develop a rational understanding of the faith, and that's important to be able to do that. It doesn't have to be a deep philosophical understanding of the faith, but a rational understanding of the faith. Very, very important for us to do that. Number two, develop a deeper understanding of the faith. Previously, it was enough for us, for example, to say, well, we believe in God and we believe in the Holy Prophet and we believe, for example, in the Day of Judgment, and these are our practices. Well, question, how do you know the Prophet of God speaks the truth and what he has in the Quran is the truth? Well, because it is divine revelation. Question, how do you know it is revelation and not just inspiration? How do you know that, the Quran has not been influenced by the prejudices of 7th century Arabia, the fact of 7th century Arabia, the knowledge of 7th century Arabia, that it is untainted by that? Well, now I have to have a deeper understanding of my faith, right? Well, you talk about the justice of God. How come there is evil and suffering in the world around us? I need to have a deeper understanding of the justice of God. So, number two, develop a deeper understanding of faith. Number three, develop a pure understanding of faith. What is a cultural understanding? What's a religious understanding? What's a cultural practice? What's a religious practice? You're forced then to distinguish between the two and to say, well, no, that's just a cultural practice. That's not a faith practice. And yes, if that is not seeming appropriate, then let's not say that the faith is wrong. Our cultural understanding of the faith, well, that's wrong. Number four, practice a relevant and dynamic interpretation of faith, because now we're forced to make faith relevant to our struggles, make faith relevant to our communities, make faith relevant to our societies. It's no longer just about how I'm different from the other. This is my faith and this is what I don't believe in, and this is what I do believe in. But it's about, okay, what difference can my faith make in my society, so that we show the relevance of it. And five, enhance our life experiences through faith. Okay. I got a couple of more slides, but I don't think I have the time to go through them. If you can just take me to the next slide. Um, so there are just some strategies here for developing faith, and then some strategies for nurturing faith. I think all of that will take some time to explain. Maybe in the next session, I'll take the first 5 to 10 minutes to explain this. And then we're going to look at the challenges facing the Muslim community and the challenges that we face in building a community and what is a community and how do you live in a community in the Western society and what are some challenges that we're facing, and perhaps we'll look at things like Islamophobia as well, inshallah. I'm going to stop over here because I want to give 2 to 3 minutes for any questions that you may have about today's session. And we will end with those questions. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. So a question, how can you develop a pure understanding when you have different views of the religion and it's confusing what to follow or who to follow? Okay. So the first thing I must say is that as human beings, we have a sense of curiosity. And when we see that there are differing opinions, the reality is that we cannot make those differing opinions go away. Okay, conflicting opinions have been there from the beginning of time. Okay, and all these conflicting opinions, what they do is they force us to think, they force us to investigate, they force us to develop a rational understanding of our faith. God has blessed us with a sense of curiosity. Well, when I see differing opinions, then I have a duty to look into it. Secondly, I have a duty to do research as well. I wish it was that easy to say that, you know what, there is one view and this is the view that we follow. Yes, when it comes to the ahkam of the deen, we do taqleed in the ahkam of the deen. You find the person who is the most learned, you follow that person. But here we're talking about, for example, the aqaid of the religion, the beliefs of the faith. There's no taqleed when it comes to the beliefs of the faith, right? Well, on those issues, we have a duty to do research and look into it and to think about it. And it forces us to do that. So the second duty is when you have a sense of curiosity, well, you've got to research it. Unfortunately, it's not going to be that simple as saying, well, follow this person or follow that person. The third step that we also need to bear in mind over there is that, this doesn't mean that we've got to research to the depths of philosophy. No, it's very interesting. There is a beautiful narration where the Holy Prophet is traveling with some of his companions, and he comes across a lady who is on a spindle or she's on some type of an old sewing machine. And he asks the lady that, do you believe in God? She says, yes. And he says, how do you know God exists? And she says that, look at this machine of mine. If I stop turning it, it stops turning. And I look at the universe and there's so much change and turning happening in the universe. And I think to myself, if nobody's moving it, then how can the universe continue to move and change? And therefore, I believe that there must be somebody turning the universe the way I'm turning this machine. The Prophet said, alaykum bidin al-ajaiz or ajuza. You, my companions, your religion should be like hers. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that one, you should have a rational understanding of your faith. Two, it doesn't have to be a really deep, philosophical. If you want to go to that level, that's fine. But it should be an understanding that is satisfying to you, right? So, when you come across these issues, then we have a duty to go and research, look into the issue to a point that it satisfies us and we say, this is the position that makes sense to me. The next thing I'd like to also say is that sometimes the difficulty that we face is that we do our research online. And most of the articles that appear online, most of the, for example, talks, sometimes these 5, 7 minute talks that appear online, they're very, very shallow. They're very, very superficial. They just skim the surface, right? They don't get into the heart of the conversation. No, we have a duty. The Quran says, yes, you have a duty to seek the truth. But when you go to seek the truth, seek it from the right person as well. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Go and ask people of the dhikr, the book, in our case, the Quran, if you do not know. Well, rather than just asking somebody knowledgeable or asking a speaker, speakers do a great favor in the community. They come, they talk. No, I need to go and talk to an alim who is well versed in that particular field. So, for example, if I want something on engineering, I speak to an engineer. I go to one of the best. Like when somebody wants to go for immigration, they'll go to a lawyer who's the best lawyer in immigration because they want the best advice. It's no different in religion. You want to go to the best scholar who's out there, search for them, and talk to them and acquire the depth of the understanding from them. Well, what if there's another scholar who has a differing opinion? Fine, go and listen to him as well, right? And acquire his thoughts on it. But now you've got both of them, and you exert your struggle in trying to ascertain what is right and what is wrong. The last thing I'll add to that is that what really, really helps us is to have a good framework of our faith. And that's one of the things I wanted to recommend, that, living in the West, we need to develop a framework for our faith. Lectures are great. Lectures provide us with very relevant information. They provide us with a good understanding of our faith. But unless we take a course on the aqaid of Islam, we take a course on the akhlaq of Islam, we take a course on the philosophy of Islam, we're not going to have a framework. It's like having a building without a framework. Yes, you can bring the best furniture in that building. You wouldn't know where to put it. You wouldn't know where it fits. If somebody comes and creates a problem, you don't know where in the building he's created that problem, right? So now when a question about faith comes up, if I have a framework, I know exactly where it fits. I know exactly where that question is supposed to go, right? But if I don't have a framework, I don't know, a framework for Tawheed, a framework for Nubuwwah, a framework for the Day of Judgment, not a profound, like deep one, just a basic understanding of it, a satisfying understanding of it, that's where a lot of doubt and questions become very, very difficult for us to reconcile. Yeah? So, curiosity, research, satisfaction, speak to scholars, persons who are well learned, and develop a framework of the faith. And that, I think, can help us develop a pure understanding of the faith, inshallah. Right, it is 7:04. I'm going to end the session over here. If you have any questions, you can always email me at the email address provided over here. And inshallah, I look forward to seeing you next week at the same time. And until then, nas'alukum ad-du'a. Please remember us in your du'as. And inshallah, we'll see you on Friday. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.